I was interviewed by the Kerner Commission. Rochester, New York is where I grew up, and Rochester was one of two cities that had two race riots in the 60s, mainly due to police brutality and low-income wages and things like that. The fact is, though, it seemingly came and went. I remember them doing the interview and issuing a report, but I don't recall it making any changes. No implementation. So when Teresa called and said, we'd like you to be on this panel, and she said, this is the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission, I was saying to myself, holy, 50 years went by and what's different, what's changed, So it was interesting to be on it, just because of remembering the way they went about it, the questions they asked. And all I could think about is that this country's gone through commissions soon after the First World War, the Gunnar Myrtelson study, that was commissioned by the Department of the Army, because blacks and people of color had fought in the First World War, and they said, we've got to do this commission to talk to these people, because now that we've taught them to shoot and use guns, what they're going to do, not ever thinking is they just be regular citizens if you give them access to jobs and education and all those things. So to me, it's really ridiculous, some of the way they go about asking questions. I remember the first question sort of was, are these riots or rebellions? Well, riots happen sometimes, just because you get fed up. A rebellion is like saying you're strategically arming to go to war against the government. Whoever thought we'd be that stupid? We don't have a military. We don't have, access to factories to develop our own weapons. And who would even think like that when the civil rights movement was based on nonviolence through what we learned from Mahatma Gandhi, about his practices in India, et cetera, and whatever else. And so rather than going to the source of the problems, they put together these commissions. Some people who were well-meaning, like Harris and whatever else, but they still don't have the feeling of the culture and the problems that actually we live in our own communities. They're always talking about what we got to do to improve the lives of people of color, working whites and whatever else. But this country has never addressed the police situation, which to us is a perpetuation and continuation of slavery. It's a control factor. Of course, it's even gone backwards with Trump in office, because Trump is just praising the men in blue rather than talking about some kind of reform and things like that. Keep people in their own places. Look what he's doing with immigrants and whatever else. Going to build a wall between California and Mexico and things like that. How much more stupid and ridiculous and separate can you be than to even come up and then suggest that Mexico is going to pay for the wall? I mean, what kind of white supremacist status is this? We asked many of the right questions, and we went about gathering the data right on the New Deal. The way they sent sociologists, academics, and other people who had the capacity to gather data and to see what kinds of things were being practiced in some places. A lot of policies even came out of those that were formative policies that were being practiced in certain places that became a part of the New Deal. And it made some changes. It perpetuated some problems too, because I just recently read a study where the New Deal is part and party to manifesting redlining. And I had never known that before. But the sooner you find out things, and the pursuit of public policy to correct those things. And so I think what's wrong is that there's too many people at the top making these decisions. And I directed this program in Boston called the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. And it was made up of a population of blacks, Latinos, Cape Verdeans, and poor whites. And we created a master plan, even though the numbers were different. I mean, it was like 30% black, 25% Latino, 20-something% Cape Verdean, 10% white. We gave equal number of seats on the board to each ethnic group so that we focus on the problems and not on each other. And Boston has more universities and colleges than any city in the world. And the academics said, my God, we never would have thought of anything like that. The first thing we got was translation equipment so that everybody could speak in their own language, so that they could participate, because immigrants have a lot of good ideas of building communities, even from a poor standpoint, things that were put into practice in Africa, in Asian countries, and in Latino countries, this and that. I, being with the World Peace Council, went in and out of various parts of the Caribbean and other places, and some of the creative programs, which we never would honor in this country, around community building, are greatly practiced in countries like that, third world countries. So we have a lot to learn. And this country keeps thinking that we are the most intelligent, whatever else could come, but we have to remember how this country was founded. Remember, there used to be a time when they say the sun never sets on the British Empire, and then, of course, as they lost their clout, and there was disillusion between some of the working class and whatever, they came to these shores, supposedly, to have a revolutionary war. Now, how do you have a revolutionary war on a country different than the country where you came from? That's where the revolution should be, where you're having problems. We come here, we displace the Native Americans, and then Britain decides that in order to enhance its economy, it needs cotton, because they were getting into the textile industry, whatever else. They go back to the United States, some of their old friends, and say, we need cotton. Well, we got plenty of land here. The United States said, well, let us go get some slaves and come back and we'll grow the cotton and this and that. So the founding of this country always was to perpetuate those who were like, of the ruling class, those who were disenfranchised or whatever else, at the expense of everybody else. Then they talk about we're going to create a democratic government. One of the first things they said were blacks were 3/5 human beings. And, women didn't have rights to vote and all these kinds of things. How do you build a democracy on those? And we've never, I'll give you an example. We talk about the great things that LBJ did, and some of them were. But he created the Voting Rights Act. See, Americans don't think. Why is it everybody else has the right to vote under the Constitution? They have to create an act for us, which has to be renewed every 15 years. I don't even understand how something like that is supposed to be. And then the Supreme Court just gutted the Voting Rights Act a few years ago, the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, and threw it back to the Congress, and it's never been integrated again. So when you go back after the Voting Rights Act and things like that in the South, where I've done some work, a lot of people are still sharecroppers. That is, the plantation owners still hold papers on it. That's why a lot of blacks, as soon as they finish high school, escape to the north or someplace just to get an education and didn't find a real job. That still exists to this day. America doesn't know that, the average person, because we've come to a place where we're so individualistic. Capitalism has perpetuated us doing things, on our own. So a lot of people work 2 or 3 jobs. They come home, drink a beer, watch television, get taken by commercials, etc., whatever else. But there is not that common focus to look collectively together how we raise a quality of life to create what Martin Luther King was talking about, the beloved community, etc., and this and that. And I have real concerns because my great-grandmother was a slave. That's how I got so. My grandmother started taking me to see Paul Robeson and people like that when I was 5 years old. That's how I became an activist. But I think now, my granddaughter, who's 17, she graduated from high school this year. She got accepted to Loyola. She's going to study music psychology. I was really pleased that she even come up with that as what she wanted to do, isn't that? But the cost of housing and things like that, most young people that you interview today that are in college or going into the world of work think that they'll never be able to own a house because of the cost of housing, et cetera, and this, that. And we're not making it any easier for them or working out programs. Trump just purchased 2 new planes to fly him around the country at the tune of $30 billion. And here we can't even make housing available to people. We're the only country in the world that students have to pay loans that makes them graduate into slavery? When do we start thinking about the human aspect of making life better for everybody to live side by side to create? And not only that, we got military bases in over 800 countries. We have the biggest military budget ever in the history of the world. Imperialism, American hegemony, and colonialism is the founding thing that we still practice. If we get rid of all these military bases and help to exchange with other countries and things, we could help each country manifest that which would benefit them mostly in living happily, side by side, developing their own people, et cetera, whatever. We'd have less wars. I mean, the NRA controls our Congress, and we see what just happened in Florida and things like that. Are things getting any better? I mean, I applaud these young people who are going to do that march in D.C. next week and the way they're organizing, and hopefully more people get to them. And I say, people, we've got to create an integrated movement. Civil rights, human rights, environmental, anti-oppression, etc. Women, I mean, when I talk to young people today about ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, they don't even know what that is. The Equal Rights Amendment was voted on 30 or 40 years ago to give women equal rights. We've never heard of it again. I mean, things like that. So it's unbelievable. We're 37th in the world in education now and falling. I've been to Cuba 12, 13 times. And the illiteracy rate in Cuba is 0.2%. On the poorest countries in the world, but they put their money where it should be in healthcare and education. We who think we know it all and we're the greatest, we got a lot to learn. What's colonialism, capitalism, you know, perpetuates control of the banking industry, et cetera, whatever else, Wall Street. Our government, remember, Bill Clinton changed Glass-Steagall, some of those, the banking stuff. If we look at the people, even who the Democratic Party has put into high financial positions, that's hand in hand with Wall Street. I mean, remember last year during the primary when Bernie Sanders would challenge Hillary Clinton, you know, explain to us what you're saying in these speeches allow you to get $500,000 a speech. She never would reveal that. Trump runs for office, gets elected. He has not shown the American people to this day his tax return. I got a friend, D.L. Hughley, who's a black comedian, who has his own radio show. D.L., I said on his show a few months ago, I just figured out why Trump has not yet shown us his tax return. I said, why? Because Russia didn't issue his W-2. You know, I mean, duh, you know, and the American people, you know, aren't even aware of that. What's his name, Soros. There's a Soros Foundation, who's a billionaire. I've been on a couple of panels with him. Knows that Trump has X number of businesses in Russia. One of them that he filed there was something to fix voting machines. The voting machines failed in Florida, in Ohio, in Michigan, and someplace else a few years ago, and Trump brought up the company and something to change it. They sort of predicted at the final thing of the 2016 primary where there are going to be problems. Trump overtook Hillary at the 11th hour in places like Michigan. Now, some places was because the people in those places were tired. Obama bailed out the automobile industry. He didn't bail out Detroit. He went to Flint, Michigan to drink the water, but he didn't build new pipes for them. People under those circumstances get tired and just stop voting. And we have to understand why people are like that and the kinds of things we want to do. People just want to be treated, you know, like human beings. They want to be able to get educated, let their sons and younger people go to schools. Why aren't we teaching coding, you know, in our schools right now so that many of our kids can get into the high-tech industries, you know, et cetera, Apple and them? Is that? These are just basic questions that seemingly are sensible questions, but they're not even being asked. We don't even expect that of government anymore. I was just on the Unity Reform Committee of the Democrat National Committee, appointed by Bernie Sanders, who's one of my closest friends. I love Bernie Sanders. The millennials were really out there campaigning for him. They really wanted to get in the political arena. We had a meeting here in Chicago, one of our 7 places we met last year. A white woman drove all the way from West Virginia to show us that Bernie had won 80-something% of the vote in West Virginia. But who got all the delegates? Hillary. Why? Because the superdelegates are, and we try to reform that, as well as electoral and other kinds of things. So what it showed is Bernie actually, and during the primary, got many more votes than Hillary did in some place, but even the media didn't reveal something, that they don't do that kind of research. And research and data and analysis is so necessary. We use that a lot when I do community development. Now, I worked with the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT and later became a senior fellow, a Martin Luther King fellow at MIT to help work with community planning development. But, you know, it really hurts because the fact is, there's always going to be a bit of racism. Some people who feel that they aren't getting what they should because people of color are getting too much. But I worked in Council Bluffs, Iowa. I was invited in by a foundation 3 years ago to work with a 97% poor white community. A lot of the men there had been participants in the Korean War, other kinds of things. They come home, there's no real jobs for them. They get to drinking and stuff, they leave their wives, they don't get involved with their children. I went through the history of that and explained certain things. These guys got involved again, and then I told sociologists. There's a study that showed that white men between the ages of 32 and 65 are dying at the rate of 130 a day because of opioid and drug overdose. Why? Because they don't have good jobs. Trump sold them a bill of goods saying, I'm gonna bring the jobs back to America, and them guys believed it. That's why they voted for him. Trump hasn't brought a goddamn thing back to them, you know, this and that. And so the reality, and when I explain to them that you become victims of the same kind of thing, and I talk to sociologists and say, why aren't we dealing with this, what's happening to white men? Because their life expectancy is just gone down by 2 years. You know what the sociologists tell me? I said, you always talk about the problem in the black community, communities of color, you know, and you put that out there as something very negative, but you won't look at the common problem. Oh, we don't have time to talk about that. I said, boy, this is a damn shame. So there's a great number of people who still want to do the right thing, don't misunderstand me, but we're not getting the guidance. Or even where I've done very good work in community development is with academic institutes. We've got to find a friend, though, in those institutes who want to really do the kind of work we want, not just a perpetuation of the status quo. Because at MIT, some professors asked me, where did you get those ideas for that stuff that you're doing and the work you're doing? There's nothing in the literature about it. I said, I know it isn't, because you all don't take any of us and people who live in those communities to write with you. Because you want to get credit for that so that you get, you know, your tenure and all that. They went away. They didn't want to talk about it anymore. It's great what Teresa's doing. But how do we expand that? How do we get more exposure from it? How do we get more funds to make this applied to be worked through communities and such and whatever? I don't know. I don't know the Chicago scene. You know, well, Teresa did that study on unemployment and jobs that really spelled out the conditions in Chicago. Rahm Emanuel then commissions another study and hires some white woman who's a friend of his to do the same thing, to spend I don't know how much money when he could have given Teresa and then more money to her, and then began working with private sector and the industries to educate and develop more people to get into some of these jobs. Politics plays a mean role. I grew up in Rochester, New York. As I said, my great-grandmother was a slave, so her daughter, my grandmother, dropped out of school in the 4th grade. She went to school late one day after picking cotton in Virginia, walks in, white teacher slaps her, she walks out of school, never goes back. But she trained herself to become an ardent reader. Then she moved her family. My mother, her husband had been wounded in a mine accident, to Pittsburgh, where she had cousins, and then to Rochester, where she had a sister. best kind of work she could get was an elevator operation, cleaning white people's homes and this and that. But she stayed involved in all kinds of activities and things. The church played a central role in the era that Martin Luther King calls the beloved community, because you had blue collar, no collar, trying to get a collar and whatever else living side by side, but there was common respect. And we learned much of that through stuff that Martin Luther King and other people engaged Mahatma Gandhi about, you know, and whatever. So police brutality was rampant though in Rochester. I mean, I got knocked off a corner when I was 11 years old by a cop. When I came out of the military, I got drafted. I went to college for a while and I dropped out. When I came out of the military, civil rights movement was in full swing, and there was a blatant police brutality case, the Rufus Farwell case, which they put me in charge of, and was the first civil rights case won in the federal court. The cop that brutally beat him because he was closing a gas station like that he owned said there's no way a black could have owned. This is in the North. This cop, when we went back and checked this whole record, he beat a nun to within an inch of her life when he was in high school. And that shows that they never even checked his record, who he was or whatever else. That's happening to police departments throughout this country. They don't care. They're just meant to be goons and keep control, you know, for the ruling class, you know, et cetera, whatever else. So, and then what happened? They raided the Black Muslim mosque in Rochester, and Malcolm X called Daisy Bates, who was responsible for integrating the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. She was in Rochester doing some organizing for the NAACP. I said, Daisy, I'm coming to Rochester. Who should I be in touch with? She never told me. She gave me my phone number. Malcolm X calls, and I'm, oh my God. He talked to me every night for 2 weeks, for 2 hours. He flew into Rochester on a cold February day. Planes used to land on the tarmac then. So I'm standing inside the airport waiting for him today, coming in. And I'm surrounded by all these white men in white shirts and ties and felt hats. And I'm naive, you know, I'm young, I'm like 25, 26, and I'm thinking these guys are all going off to New York or someplace for business. Malcolm walks through the door and said, who is Gus Newport? I said, I am. He said, young blood, you got the best tap telephone in America. This is all FBI here. So we went on to visit the Muslims that they had put in jail, and because they didn't eat pork or anything, they wouldn't drink nothing but milk. We go to the district attorney's office and to the sheriff's office, and Malcolm and he had a discussion, and Malcolm was part of some Eastern Star organization, so was the sheriff, so they compared those. And after the talk, we went to the trial. We're sitting in the courtroom, and this sheriff is about 500 pounds, a big, heavy-set guy. And I'm sitting on the other side with Malcolm. Malcolm says, because my first name is Eugene, so rather than call me by Gus, my nickname, call me Brother Eugene. Look over there, look at the sheriff. And the sheriff had fallen asleep. He said, the power of Allah took that cracker's heart, and he died. And I said, Malcolm, be cool. And he woke up, he said, damn, Allah didn't do the job, you know. But things like this, you know. And then Malcolm spoke at a couple of nonprofit settlement houses. The state legislature in New York, in 24 hours, passed a law that no place that had foundation funding or government funding could allow Malcolm X to speak. They passed that law in one day. And so then after I got more active with Malcolm, I wasn't in the nation, but I couldn't hold a job in Rochester, so I ended up going to New York and working, and I was mentored by Malcolm and Adam Clayton Powell. I worked for IBM because I'd learned the old mainframe, electric data processing, all this stuff when I was in the military, and worked with Howard UAC, and that was sort of my beginnings as an activist person that went on to going all over the country looking at job development and things like that and whatever else. I traveled with Malcolm X 4 days before he was assassinated. He was invited to come back to Rochester and he asked me to fly with him. We're doing a video documentary right now. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King had become friends like that. Does history in this country show that? No. History is not recorded in the United States, it's propaganda. They had become very close. Malcolm had gone on the Hajj to Madagascar. He debated at London School of Economics and Oxford. He had then left the Nation of Islam after Elijah Muhammad put him out when he said that the chickens are coming home to roost when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The media didn't pick that up. The reason he said that, because JFK pulled together a meeting between the Ku Klux Klan and the Nation of Islam because there were two nationalist countries that wanted a part of the southeast of this country. And it started for that. And when Malcolm got put down for saying that and then was invited back, he never went back. He moved to the civil rights movement. He goes to these places. He stopped calling white people devils. He slipped once in a while, and he was debating a guy at Oxford. He said, Malcolm, I thought you said you were not going to call white people devils anymore. Malcolm stopped for a minute, 30 seconds. Then he said, I am, but who's going to replace you? And that just, the place cracked up. But when he came back, we had a meeting at Sidney Poitier's house. Malcolm was there, A. Philip Randolph, Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee. Martin Luther King was on the phone because he'd gotten arrested once again for demonstrating in Florida. And it was agreed that Malcolm was going to go before the United Nations and file a suit against American hegemony, colonialism, imperialism, and racism. Because he said in talking to the leaders of the African and Asian countries, they all figured out that we're all victims of the same thing, these particular things. And so let's open it up on the floor of the United Nations, et cetera, whatever else. Malcolm's phone was tapped at that time. We've now got records, this documentary we're doing, from New York police, them over 80 now. We decided to pursue it because through a study we found out men have a tendency, after they reach the age of 80, to try to want to correct some of the things they did that were not right. The police department has given us these records. The FBI and the New York police were involved in Malcolm's death. J. Edgar Hoover was on one of these calls, and he was overheard saying that Malcolm and Martin are the two most dangerous black men in the world. 35 days later, Malcolm X is dead. So that's how I've just stayed so involved, because I've been aware of certain things, and I know that, as I say, history is not truly recorded in the United States. I call it propaganda because we adjust things as we want it. For an example, who do we think of as the founding father of our country? George Washington. But we tell a little story about George Washington was interviewed by the press, and to try to make him look good, he says, I cannot tell a lie, I cut down a cherry tree. They don't tell the story that when he came to office, when he had owned 60 slaves, and when he married Martha, she brought 180. That's not well, how could that be the father of our country? If he believed even after laws changed, he circumvented all the slave laws and this and that thing. So things like that, the average American doesn't know. Now, I'm not intelligent, I'm not an academic, I've just had enough exposure. But wouldn't it be nice if we knew the truth of our country and what the kinds of things we had to clean up? If we stopped playing with countries. I mean, this is what we're going through right now with North Korea and whatever else. I know someone's totally ridiculous, but you know, those countries have all been exploited, whatever, too, this and that. And we perpetuate and maintain their being poor. I was in Vietnam last year. I had some great discussions. The Vietnamese people are just as sweet to us, you know, and whatever else. And I went all through the country. In the last couple of days, I was in Ho Chi Minh City, and they took us down through the little caves that they dug, you know, during the war. And they actually built these caves underneath American military bases and drilled holes so they could hear everything they were saying. They took their families down there. Women had babies down there, whatever else. The last day, we met with veterans of the Viet Cong. And they said, look, 14 Americans, they said, we want you to know we still are somewhat in control in Vietnam, but we don't show our faces. The socialists run the government, but everybody can vote for whomever they want to. He said, you know what? We think we're more democratic than the United States is. And I said, yes. They said, we know you, Gus, because you were with the World Peace Council. And some of the Americans didn't like it because they don't want to believe that we were wrong for being in Vietnam. And there's all the reason in the world why that could be, you know, blamed. But see, we don't have a knowledge of our own history. Most Americans don't, because our education doesn't really provide that. Our history is written in bits and pieces, and it's adjusted to make us look like the great founding fathers, you know, this and that and whatever else. And I think it's great when different commissions come, like the Kerner Report and whatever else, that ask a whole lot of right questions, but we did not put the resources and things in it to follow up, such as happened in the New Deal, to make the necessary corrections so we can become a competitive country that's not manifesting our economics through war and militarism. Well, I got elected right after Proposition 13 was passed, which was a cut on real estate taxes that put more money in the pocket of the rich, you know, and other kinds of things. So one of the first things we did was reorganize our police department. One, because Berkeley's police department got a little rough too. And we brought in an organization called Police Officers Standard Training or something, because we had like one administrator for every 3 police, and no other place in the country had anything like that. We brought that and we reorganized that. We also reorganized so police and fire could do the same things, because most times firemen are just in the firehouse sleeping, except for when there's a fire. So if they're learned to do the jobs cohortly, it expands the number. Homelessness was beginning to broaden, so we brought in mental health workers to work the streets with police so that they would be treated right. And what we did is I used my conference room for leaders of the homeless to come and have meetings. We got them post office boxes so they could get SSI or other kinds of things. We took school buses and put them down on our marina where they could stay, and then porta potties and other kinds of things like that, but also got them access to job training and other kinds of things, and made them feel that they had a stay in their lives. And then we, as we were financing some of these programs, we re-looked at our tax standards, and churches don't pay anything because, you know, it's supposed to be separation church. I said, but what the hell? Their people drive our streets. They come to night meetings or whatever. We charge taxes on the churches. Oh, they raised hell. I said, well, should we cut the lights off at nights when you all got meetings and things? So we were able to do that. We were the first sanctuary city that people coming from Central America during the Civil War and stuff would come to. And I was actually invited to go into El Salvador after Archbishop Romero was killed by the FMLN. So we began to get exposure and things and learn more about economic development, community development. Things got federal grants to examine more of that, and provided, you know, programs for young people, et cetera, whatever else. But you could only do this if you're working with a collective group of people and examining what are the gaps and what are needed. And so that's what I learned. I never aspired to elected office. I got drafted because of things that I had been doing. And then when I'm a progressive, but some of the liberals became very single issue and stopped trying to do certain kinds of affordable housing program stuff. So I decided at that point I had it with politics, and UMass Boston invited me to be the first senior fellow at the William Monroe Trotter Institute, to teach a course on alternative economics and public policy. And that's when I went on to my next places in life. So. Well, we were founded brutally. I mean, you know, we came in, we sort of made friends supposedly with the Native Americans, and next thing we know, they're on reservations. In the movies industry showed Native Americans all being savages. We were the good guys, you know, wore the white hats and stuff. You know, you think that we interned the Japanese during the Second World War. No country has ever done that. They're citizens, they're meaningful citizens, this and that and whatever else. We are first in all those kinds of things. And whenever we're first now talking about building a wall between California and Mexico. Half of that land in Southern California we took from the Mexicans, from Mexico. And this work requires continuity, some comedy. I mean, a good friend of mine, Danny Glover, and I, and a couple of people just came back from Honduras and Costa Rica, working with some elections down there and went down there to help protect a Jesuit priest who's very progressive, whose life is in danger because the last presidential election just violated all standards. The guy shouldn't be able to, in Honduras. One of the guys that went with us was Cedric the Entertainer, another comedian, black comedian. Cedric told us a story about, and we know it was one of his jokes, but he went to Mexico and was performing right after Trump started talking about building a 15-foot wall and making Mexico pay for it. So Cedric said he went to visit some of the high schools in Mexico to see how the young people were feeling, because a lot of them come across, back and forth across the border for work and to visit family. He said the athletes took them out to the athletic field and they were teaching pole vaulting to students, and they had already got to 17 feet. So you see, the movement has to have, comedy, it requires the arts, poetry and music, etc., and whatever else. We've gotten so far from real movements in this country that a lot of people have never witnessed or been a part of that, and we got to somehow come back to that, because I think the movement we need now is not only an integration of civil rights and human rights, but environmental rights, of economic rights, all those kinds of things.
Not just charts and books.
Right, to look at what a holistic country should look like. And we claim to be the greatest country ever in the history of the world. I don't know where that bullshit comes from based on what I've witnessed, but there are a lot of good people out there still pursuing it. I mean, I was glad that Harris was able to present to us, stuff that they did today, because and how do we put it into being, into working